So next up is Kim again with quite a different presentation, talking just pretty much, giving us an update on where we are with PTI and IANA. And Roy, just add 5 minutes, so we're okay. You can even spell them out.
Well, instead of giving you a generic presentation about PTI, which personally I've heard enough of, I wanted to talk to you more technically about the roadmap that we currently have for root zone management, the projects that we're working on to move the needle on how we're performing the root zone management functions. So for those that are not familiar with our role here, the IANA team is responsible for managing the contents of the root zone and the associated database. So that's who is officially responsible for operating a domain, who the contact persons are, and obviously the technical delegation data, the NS records, the DS records, and the GLUE records. And in doing so, we provide interfaces to TLD operators to do these kinds of changes. TLD operator has routine changes they need to do, personnel changes, changes to their NS set, but also more fundamental changes, such as when we see a TLD transfer from one registry service provider to another, where we see a CCTLD move to a whole new operator. Our staff's role is to review all of these changes, ensure they meet a variety of technical and operational criteria that are derived from community policies, and also to ensure that consent is received from the correct parties. The root zone has a fairly peculiar set of requirements, particularly in terms of a transfer that requires a lot of analysis and evaluation in order to assure that the right parties have consented to those kinds of changes. Once we're satisfied that the policy has been met and we've completed our administrative processing, when the change pertains to changes to the root zone file itself, we transmit those validated changes to VeriSign. They're contracted to ICANN as the root zone maintainer, and VeriSign's responsibility is to update the file, sign it, and propagate the new root zone file to the root servers. And the last point is that much of the mechanisms and practices associated with how we do this root zone operation is really inherited from many decades of operation. So what I'm about to embark on telling you about is really adjusting some of the fundamental assumptions that have really structured how we do root zone management up until now. So around 10 years ago, if you needed to do a root zone change, it was fully manual. You wrote an email to our staff, they read your email, they sent emails to some other people, they did some more emails, maybe they dropped to a shell and ran dig a few times. We had internal procedures that were quite robust and detailed. But nonetheless, it was manual. And then once we'd finished our processing, we would transmit an email to NTIA and VeriSign for implementation, and the workflow was fairly cumbersome. This was recognized as a suboptimal practice quite some time ago, and like as I mentioned, around 10 years ago, this changed. We implemented an automation system called the root zone management system, quite creative, and the root zone management system's job is essentially to both provide self-service capability to TLDs so they can log in, do the changes they want via a web interface, and also to shepherd change requests throughout all the different stages of processing. So customers can submit the change request, but also track it as it goes through the processing. Then from a staff side, all the bits that used to be manual are now automated, and the stuff that still needs to be manually performed by staff is enhanced and shepherded by the system. So we deployed that 10 years ago, and we still use the same system today, although we have made a few major changes, first of which was the introduction of DNSSEC obviously required us to manage DS records, so we added that support. The new GTLD program necessitated us scaling up to supporting over 1,000 new TLDs that we hadn't had in the past, and in particular, delegating new GTLDs was something we did maybe once a year on average, and that moved to being something we did once a day. So we needed to scale up that capacity, so we did things like doing integrations with Salesforce.com that runs the news utility program and steps like that. And then finally, for those that aren't aware, up until October of last year, the US government was involved in every single root zone change. Once we'd done our validation, it was sent to the US government for authorization, and only upon their authorization would VeriSign commit the change to the root zone file. With the completion of the IANA stewardship transition, that's no longer required, so we made some major changes to our systems, essentially ripping out all the bits associated with the US government. So what are we working on now? Firstly, a couple of features we're adding to the current system, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about essentially a ground-up rewrite of the root zone management system that we're undertaking right now to fundamentally alter some of the aspects of how we do root zone changes. Modifications to the existing system. Firstly, some new automated workflows. Today, all the routine changes that you might do in the root are communicated between us and VeriSign by EPP. However, there's a few business processes that we still do that are communicated manually between the two parties. And as part of concluding the transition, we agreed between us that we should aim and get to a point where 100% of information communicated between us and VeriSign is over EPP. That leaves three things that we're working on. One is changing the authorities for the root zone, i.e. the root servers. Secondly, deleting a TLD. And thirdly, whenever we need to do an escalation due to an emergency change request, usually we escalate it with VeriSign out of band, but we want some in-band signaling as well as the escalation status, so that is communicated between our systems. So the aim is by later this year to have 100% of interactions between us and VeriSign communicated by EPP, and this is echoed in the root zone maintainer agreement. The other thing we're working on for the current system for the near future is to roll out updates to support additional DNSSEC algorithms. We heard earlier today surveys about increasing popularity of things like elliptic curve cryptography. So those in green are those that are supported today in the root zone. The other ones are basically algorithms under evaluation. We're not committing to supporting all of them at this stage, but our goal is to support as many as we can that have mature software support and are demanded by or requested by our customers. There's some facets to that that I won't get into, but there are questions about whether the root zone should support more experimental algorithms. That's probably a discussion for another day, but there's two sides to that coin, I suppose. Our view has been that the TLD is, the root zone is critical infrastructure, and we should be conservative in our approach to supporting brand new algorithms in it. So moving on to things that are informing how we implement the next generation of root zone management software. The biggest one, I think, is a new authorization model. Today, the root zone has a specific model that's rooted in the past that I'll get to in a moment. And a lot of the pain points we get from our customers is the way you currently need to submit and manage root zone change requests is not ideal because of the way the contact model is structured. So what we're trying to do is find a mechanism that is flexible enough that hopefully all, but if not all, the vast majority of TLDs have enough flexibility that they can manage the TLD in a way that works for them, that is not overly burdensome. And one of the key foundations for this is decoupling two different roles that root zone customers, TLD managers, do, which is the authorization role, which is contacts are required to approve change requests. And secondly is the publish contact role, which is essentially being listed in the WHOIS database. By decoupling those, it will address quite a few of the pain points that we see. So we're seeking feedback at the moment. We're in the preliminary stages of developing this capability, but it's certainly not all finalized, and there's still discussions to be had with the TLD operator community. So we're certainly keen to get feedback on it. So just real quickly, I mean, how does this split work? Well, today we have an admin and a tech contact. Both of these are listed in the public who is. Both of these are required to approve change requests on behalf of the TLD operator. And then also in the case of CCTLDs, the admin contact is obligated by RFC 1591 to be based in the country. So this is essentially how it works. The admin and tech contacts now become public who is contacts. And this will allow TLD operators to list possibly more appropriate parties for general contact to be in the who is. Rather than listing your CEO, for example, you might list your help desk contact so that they can field inquiries, just general customer service inquiries regarding that particular domain, for example. And then we're adding this new concept called authorizing contacts. And the authorizing contacts are basically private contacts that you nominate to manage your own TLD. You can have one or more, you can have 5, you can have 10. There's no fixed number. You can configure it how you want for your organization. They must be people. There's no role accounts. If you wanted a role account, then you would actually create individual accounts for all the people that would sit behind that role account. We would have stronger identity controls. By making sure they're people, it allows us to more easily recover credentials in case they get lost. We can have alternative mechanisms to identify if that person is who they say they are. We have flexible threshold approval options, which means that you could have 10 contacts and you can nominate, well, in these circumstances, I just need one of those people to approve a change request. But if you're transferring my TLD to someone else, heck, you need all 10 to approve it. Like, you can set up threshold conditions and boundaries that satisfy your internal business processes and risk aversion and so forth. Okay, so the next topic I wanted to talk about was a new technical check implementation. I think this is something that I personally have a great deal of difficulty with in the sense that the technical check system we have today works, but it provides very difficult to pass output. So one of the common bits of feedback we get is that the output is not easy to digest, and that usually means tickets where we get those kinds of feedback come to me and I have to explain them all. So what we'd like to do is enhance this significantly by providing a much richer interface to doing technical checks, providing detailed feedback on what's happened, what went wrong, and adding additional features that aren't there today. For example, capturing the complete debugging logs from our test runs so that TLD operators can view each individual query and packet that we receive to identify what issues that we've seen without us having to scrape through those logs ourselves. Improving the parallelism of the system. Today we have some queuing delays if a lot of tickets are implemented at the same time. So if we can build a better parallelizable system, that will reduce testing time. And then lastly, the capability to flag certain issues like serial numbers out of sync that are relatively minor as known issues so that in future we don't retest and fail on those issues again. Our third feature I wanted to mention was the new customer API. Today, the API is a web interface that people interact with. We want to provide a proper JSON or what have you API where customers can build their own tooling to connect to it, submit change requests, monitor change requests, do all the functionality they can do today. This has a few obvious benefits. In particular, customers with large portfolios of TLDs doing things like typing in DS records across their whole portfolio when they do key roles is very error prone. So this will eliminate problems there. And then also, I mean, we just did a change a couple of days ago. One particular TLD vendor had to change their admin contact for 198 domains all at once. So doing those kind of bulk operations will be a lot more practical using an API interface. New security options, and this is kind of tied to the authorization model, adding two-factor authentication, migrating from role accounts to person-based accounts, eliminating some of the historical baggage associated with it, such as email-based submission of root zone change requests, and also having a comprehensive audit trail available to customers to see who did what when. We do have that information today, but it's stored in internal logging. We want to expose that to the customer, so you can log in at any time, look at your TLD, see the history of who's logged into what accounts and what they've done. Slightly on the policy change, policy side, some changes associated with the framework of interpretation. For those that aren't familiar with this, the CCNSO went through, did the math yesterday, about 6 years of workshops and working groups to come up with a set of guidance on how CCTLD transfers should be done. And we're now in the process of implementing that, and a lot of that includes phasing out terms like redelegation and sponsoring organization, and doing some other kinds of changes. They call something called a delegation contact, basically a designated person whose only role is to approve redelegations. So we're working through business process changes to accommodate those FOI recommendations. So that's it. I don't know how many TLD operators are in the room, if anyone has any interest or comments on this, but I'd be very happy to hear it.
Hi, Matt Poundstead from RightSide. Thanks very much for this update. It's very helpful to kind of know what's coming down the pipe. I have a couple of suggestions. They're sort of both related to the question of the API. The first is it might be worthwhile reconsidering the complete move away from role accounts. For example, if I have a piece of software submitting DS updates for my TLDs, I don't want to be using an individual's credentials for that. So it might be necessary to continue to have role accounts, but perhaps have them limited to use at the API or something like that.
So on that, firstly, we do want to have the support for the concept of API keys.
Yeah,
so maybe that will address that issue.
Probably would.
The reason why we want to phase out role accounts in general, and it's not an absolute, but we have a real problem identifying who's behind a role account.
Yeah, I fully understand.
And that's an operational difficulty we have, and it introduces security problems as well. So that's the primary driver behind that.
Okay. And I guess the other comment I had is if there's any temptation to completely design and then develop and roll out an API that solves all problems, please don't do it that way. Please pick out the worst pain points and implement them and sort of gradually roll out features, because there are some things, particularly around DS roles and approvals of DS change submissions, that are huge pain points and huge time wasters at registry operators. So,
yeah, I think we're not trying to boil the ocean. I mean, the Rizzo management system is a critical piece of software, but it doesn't have a lot of customer functionality, I don't think. But the focus initially definitely will be on submission and just the common customer interactions, and then there's probably a long tail of things beyond that.
Hi, Oli Schocher from Switch. I wanted to ask, can you talk about the time frame, especially when can we add ECDS ADS records?
So we don't have an exact time frame for that functionality. We are actively working on it right now. I think I can say this year, but probably not more specific than that. In terms of the next generation functionality, the authorization model changes and so on, really targeting next year for a lot of that to be deployed. But those initial changes in terms of automating 100% of changes and the new algorithms, definitely this year.
Hi, Jacques with Syrah. Quick one. For emails that you send for root zone management, are you going to get rid of those?
We're going to, the goal there is to make it somewhat more customizable. Generally speaking, the emails would by default stay the same, but we definitely have customers that, I mean, the one I just mentioned a few days ago, they get 200 emails for a single change as a consequence of the way it's designed. So adding some additional flexibility on when emails get sent is something that we'd like to add. But I suspect you're asking the question from a security perspective. That
right now you can approve a change just by clicking on the email, a link, and say approve without any knowing of who's behind it.
So a key point of the new authorization model is you have to authenticate to approve. So Today we rely on a random token that's in the email to verify custody of the email address. And partly that's driven by the fact that today it's not obligatory to have an account in the system. So we have a large number of TLD operators that have no logins. Email is the only mechanism we have to approve change requests. But in this new model, we'll move to becoming a mandatory system where you must authenticate, and then you can add second factor to your account if you so desire to add additional security.
All right, thanks.
And one last question.
Sure. I would say don't kill emails, please. These are good, but I would just recommend to add login log and maybe DFA log and everything. So basically any approval or disapproval should be logged separately. So for example, if I suspect that somebody is in possession of my tokens, I can log in separately and see which authentication actions have been performed, logins and approvals. So basically an audit log, maybe separate channel for that, so you can even have an audit contact which cannot do anything, but yet they can log in and see what actions has been taken. So store the channel.
So I think the audit logging, the goal is to make it comprehensive, and if you want to filter it on certain types of events, you can. So hopefully we'll capture those kinds of events. I hadn't considered the idea of an audit user. I'm reluctant to make the system more complicated than it needs to be. If we can get away with just having credentialed users have access to the audit logs for the TLDs they manage. With respect to keeping email-based approvals, this is the first time I've heard a request for that. We'll monitor the feedback that we get. If there is a broad desire to retain that possibility, then it's certainly something we can add as something that you can configure based on your preference at a domain level. But our ideal would be to move to this new model comprehensively if we can.
Right. Well, let's discuss it later. Maybe have to be more architectural discussion because now it's too short time for that.
Of course. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.